Learn your place. You do not belong here.
The first thing you need to understand is that by the time this evening ends, one woman in this story will have been on her knees in front of 40 strangers, and the other will still believe she's the one in control of everything. Only one of them is right. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. It was a Saturday evening in late spring, the kind of evening that Belmont Manor had been built for 100 years earlier, when the Ashford family first strung lights along the veranda and decided that this house would always be a place where beautiful things happened in front of an audience. Camille Ashford had planned this party for 6 weeks, working through 3 different florists before settling on one, rewriting the seating chart 4 separate times, because for Camille, a party was never simply an evening. It was a performance, and she was always both the director and the star of it. 40 guests stood scattered across the lawn in low light, holding champagne flutes, laughing at things that weren't especially funny, the way people laugh when they want to be seen enjoying themselves more than they actually want to enjoy themselves. String lights hung overhead in loose, warm loops between the old oak trees, and somewhere near the hedges a small band played something slow enough to talk over without anyone having to raise their voice. The air smelled like cut grass and citronella candles, and the particular expensive perfume of women who had never once had to think about what perfume cost. It was, by every visible measure, a perfect night, the kind of night that made its way into the society pages the following week with photographs that showed everything except what actually happened in it. Simone Carter did not get to enjoy perfect nights. She got to serve them. She moved through the crowd with a silver tray balanced against her palm, her glasses of champagne catching the string lights above, her steps practiced, and even after 6 years of learning exactly how to walk through rooms like this without being noticed. That was the skill nobody trained her for and nobody thanked her for. Not spilling, not speaking unless spoken to, not existing any louder than the music. She had learned to read a room the way other people read a book, understanding within seconds which guests wanted their glasses refreshed without a word exchanged, and which ones wanted the illusion of being personally attended to, a warm smile, a small comment about the weather, anything that made them feel seen without ever once seeing her in return. She had gotten good at it. Good enough that most nights, she made it from the kitchen to the garden and back a dozen times without a single person remembering her name, without a single person wondering what her life looked like once this party ended and the lights came down. Tonight would not be one of those nights. Camille turned from a conversation with a guest just as Simone passed behind her, and whether it was an accident of timing or something Camille did on purpose, some small, unconscious need to remind the evening who was truly in charge of it, the two of them collided hard enough that the tray tipped, and a full glass of red wine sailed across the front of a woman's pale blue dress. For a half second, nobody moved. The band kept playing for 2 more bars before someone signaled them to soften. Then Camille's voice rose, pitched not for the woman in the ruined dress, but for everyone within 30 feet of her, sharp and theatrical in a way that made it clear this reaction had been rehearsed long before tonight ever needed it. The way certain people rehearse outrage, the way actors rehearse a monologue, ready to deploy at the moment an audience presents itself. Oh my God. Oh my God, I am so sorry, Diane. Look at your dress. Camille pressed a hand to her own chest as if she were the one who'd been wronged, her eyes wide with a performance of horror that didn't quite reach the rest of her face. And then she turned towards Simone with an expression that had already decided how this story would be told tomorrow, over coffee, to friends who hadn't been there. This is exactly why we don't hire people who don't understand how a house like this runs. The garden went quiet in that particular way gardens go quiet when something cruel has just happened in public and everyone is deciding whether to acknowledge it or simply let it pass, the way people do when the cruelty is inconvenient to name out loud. A few guests smirked, The kind of smirk that comes easy to people who've never had to kneel down and clean up someone else's mess in front of a crowd, who have never once had to consider what it costs a person to stay silent while being humiliated for an accident they didn't cause. One man near the bar actually laughed. A short, surprised bark he tried to swallow halfway through, glancing around quickly afterward to see who had noticed. And one woman, older, silver-haired, standing near the edge of the veranda with a glass she hadn't touched all night, looked away entirely, her jaw tight, unwilling to watch what was about to happen next, though she, more than anyone else in that garden, understood exactly what was unfolding and exactly why it unsettled her more than she could explain to herself. Simone already had the cloth napkin from her apron in her hand before Camille finished the sentence. She dropped to her knees on the flagstone without being asked, without arguing, without doing anything but exactly what 6 years in this house had taught her to do, which was make the problem disappear as fast and as quietly as possible before it could grow into something louder. Her hands were not steady. She pressed the napkin to the hem of the stranger's dress and murmured an apology that was really an apology to no one, because the wine wasn't hers, the collision wasn't hers, and everyone standing in that garden knew it. Even the ones smirking, even the ones who would go home tonight and never think about this moment again. She said nothing else. Not one word in her own defense. She had learned a long time ago, in this house, under this particular kind of gaze, that silence cost less than defending herself ever would, that explaining herself only ever gave people like Camille more material to work with, more reasons to keep the performance going. What none of them knew, not Camille, not the guest in the ruined dress, not even Simone herself, kneeling on cold stone with wine soaking into a cloth napkin, was that somewhere inside that very house, in a drawer that had not been opened in 11 years, sat a single document that would have changed the shape of everything happening on that lawn. A will. Simone's name written into it in ink that had long since dried, naming her the sole heir to Belmont Manor and every single thing it held, every acre of land, every account, every brick of a house that had just watched her apologize on her knees for something she never did. Eleanor Ashford knew it was there. She had known for 11 years. Nobody else in that garden knew it existed at all, and the woman it belonged to had no idea her own name was locked 3 rooms away from where she now knelt, apologizing for a mess that was never hers to begin with. Stay with this story, because before it's over, you're going to watch every one of these small cruelties land completely differently once you understand exactly who was kneeling on that stone floor and exactly what she was kneeling in front of. The party moved on quickly, the way parties do when the wealthy decide a moment is finished and simply will it into the past. Someone offered the stranger in the ruined dress a new glass of wine and a compliment about her earrings. The band picked the tempo back up. Camille turned back to her guests with a smile already back in place. Already halfway into a new conversation about a renovation somebody's cousin was doing in the Hamptons. Already forgetting the girl on her knees the way she'd forgotten her 100 times before, because for Camille, staff were furniture that occasionally needed adjusting. Nothing more, nothing that required a second thought once the adjustment was made. Simone did not go back to the party. She carried the tray and the ruined napkin and what was left of her composure through the side door, past the kitchen where 2 other staff members glanced up and then quickly looked away, not out of indifference, but because they understood exactly what she needed in that moment was not sympathy. It was privacy, the same privacy they would have wanted for themselves. She found it in the pantry, a narrow room lined with shelves of preserves and folded linens, the smell of cinnamon and old wood settling around her, and she stood there in the dim light with her back against a shelf and her eyes closed, breathing slowly, refusing, absolutely refusing, to let a single tear fall in a house that had never once looked at her as anything more than the help. She counted her breaths the way she had taught herself to years ago, in and out, 4 counts each, A small private discipline nobody in this house knew she practiced, because if they knew, they would have found some way to make even that small mercy feel like a weakness to exploit. She did not know yet what was locked in that drawer 11 years old. She did not know her own name meant something in this house that no one had ever told her. All she knew, standing alone in that pantry with wine-stained hands, was that she was tired in a way sleep would not fix, and that somehow, she still had 6 more hours left on her shift, 6 more hours of smiling at strangers who would never once wonder what her last name was, let alone what it might one day mean. Let's go back to where this all began, because to understand exactly how Simone Carter ended up on her knees in front of 40 strangers, you need to understand who she was long before she ever set foot inside Belmont Manor. Simone Carter had a way of waking up before her alarm ever went off, a habit built over years of never quite trusting the world to leave her alone if she wasn't already awake to meet it. It was 5:40 in the morning, still dark outside the narrow window of her room in the carriage house behind the main estate, the converted staff quarters where 6 women lived in small, tidy rooms that all faced east, catching the first thin light before anyone else on the property stirred. Hers had a single bed with a quilt she'd bought secondhand years ago and mended twice since, a chest of drawers that didn't quite close all the way no matter how she angled it, and a mirror propped against the wall, its frame holding a photograph she had looked at every single morning of her adult life, without ever once knowing who was in it. It was an old photograph, worn soft at the corners from years of handling, of a young woman with a warm, uncertain smile, holding an infant wrapped in a pale blanket. The woman's eyes carried something Simone had never quite been able to name, not quite happiness, not quite fear, something suspended between the two, as if she were smiling for a camera while thinking about something else entirely. Simone had arrived at the group home in Savannah with that photograph tucked into her things when she was only a few weeks old, and in 18 years of asking, not one caseworker, not one administrator, not one person who ever touched her file could tell her who the woman was, where the photograph had come from, or why it had been the only thing anyone thought to send along with her. She stopped asking out loud around the time she turned 16, after a caseworker named Diane, kind but overworked, had sat her down and told her gently that some questions simply didn't have answers waiting at the end of them, that sometimes the not knowing was something you learned to carry rather than something you solved. Simone had nodded, thanked her, and gone back to her room, and she never stopped looking at the photograph, not once, not for a single morning in the 16 years since. She aged out of the system at 18 with a duffel bag, $200 folded into an envelope from a well-meaning volunteer, and that photograph, and she built the rest of her life out of whatever work would have her. Waitressing at a diner off the interstate where the manager shorted her tips more often than he paid them correctly. Warehouse shifts loading trucks in the dead of winter, her hands cracked and raw by January. A year cleaning office buildings at 4 in the morning before the city woke up, alone in fluorescent-lit hallways with nothing but a cart and her own thoughts for company. By the time she found her way to Belmont Manor at 26, hired through an agency after an interview that lasted 11 minutes, and asked her nothing about who she actually was, she had already learned most of what this kind of work would teach her, and what it taught her was this. Dignity wasn't something anyone gave you in a house like this. It was something you built quietly, alone, brick by brick, and carried without ever setting it down where someone could see it and decide to take it from you. She got dressed in the dark, laced her shoes at the edge of the bed, and crossed the yard toward the main house before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, the grass still wet enough to darken the hem of her pants, the air carrying that particular cold, clean smell that only exists in the last hour before a house wakes up. This was her favorite part of the day, the 20 minutes before Belmont Manor remembered it was a house full of people who needed things from her. 20 minutes where the only sounds were birds starting up in the hedges and her own footsteps on wet grass. In the kitchen, She found Rosalind Hayes already crying quietly over a pile of broken porcelain. A vase Camille had brought back from a trip to Europe 2 summers ago, shattered across the tile floor in a spray of white and blue fragments that caught the early light in a way that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. Rosalind was 20 years old, 3 months into the job, and clearly terrified, her hands shaking as she tried to gather the pieces before anyone noticed, moving too fast, cutting her thumb on a jagged edge without seeming to register the pain of it. "Please," Rosalind said, the word cracking in half, her eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "Please, I can't lose this job. My mom needs the money I send home. Please don't tell anyone it was me." Simone knelt down beside her without a word of judgment, gathering the larger pieces into a dustpan with hands that had done this kind of quiet rescue more times than she could count over 6 years, taking the cut thumb gently and pressing a clean dish towel to it before it could bleed onto the floor and become a second problem. "Nobody's losing a job over a vase," she said, low and even, the same steady tone she used for every crisis this kitchen produced. "Go get the small broom from the pantry. I'll say I was carrying it, and I slipped." It won't be the first time they've heard that story, and it won't be the last. Rosalind stared at her like she'd been handed something she didn't deserve, and maybe, in a house like this, kindness always felt like that, undeserved, suspicious in its simplicity, because so little of what this house offered came without a price attached somewhere beneath the surface. Simone had learned a long time ago that protecting people who had less power than she did cost her almost nothing and meant almost everything, and she never once made a show of it, never once brought it up afterward as a debt owed. From the doorway, unnoticed by either of them, Margaret Doyle watched the whole exchange with an expression that didn't quite belong to a head housekeeper observing her staff go about routine business. It was something closer to pride, laced with a grief so old and so carefully managed that even Margaret herself had stopped noticing she wore it most days. The way a person stops noticing the weight of something they've carried so long it's become simply part of how they stand. She had watched Simone do this exact kind of quiet, unrewarded goodness for 6 years now, and every single time, it broke something in her chest that she had promised, a long time ago, she would never let show, not to Simone, not to anyone in this house. By 7, Simone had moved through half the house, dusting the front hallway, laying out the morning papers on the sideboard exactly the way Eleanor preferred them, checking that the dining room's flowers hadn't wilted overnight, and by 7:15, she was at the greenhouse at the edge of the east garden, where Marcus Reyes was already waiting with 2 cups of coffee, one black, one with cream and too much sugar. Exactly the way she'd been drinking it since the week she started, a detail he'd never needed to ask twice. Marcus had worked the grounds at Belmont for 15 years, a steady, unhurried man who spoke like someone who had never once needed to raise his voice to be taken seriously, who moved through his days with the patience of a man who understood that most things worth growing couldn't be rushed. "You look like you slept in a dish rack," Marcus said, handing her the coffee with the same dry half-smile he greeted her with most mornings, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that made the insult land as affection instead. "Some of us don't get to spend our mornings talking to tomatoes," Simone said, wrapping both hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into fingers still cold from the wet grass. "Tomatoes don't talk back. That's the appeal." He nodded toward the main house, half-lit gold in the early sun, its windows still dark on the upper floors where the family slept late. "You run this place better than she does, and everybody in that kitchen knows it. Everybody in that kitchen also knows what happens to people who say that kind of thing out loud." Simone took a sip, letting the warmth settle into her hands, watching a bee move lazily between the greenhouse's open panels. But there was something easy about these 10 minutes at the greenhouse every morning, something that had nothing to do with silver trays or ruined dresses or the particular exhaustion of being invisible on purpose. Here, for 10 minutes, She was just a woman drinking coffee with a friend, and it was the only part of her day that felt entirely, uncomplicatedly hers, untouched by anyone else's expectations of what she was supposed to be. Marcus had wondered, more than once, in 15 years of watching this family from the edge of their lawn, why Eleanor Ashford looked at Simone the way she did. It wasn't the detached distance most wealthy women held toward the staff, the polite blindness that let them walk past someone every day without truly seeing them. It was something else, something that looked, if you caught it at the wrong angle in the wrong light, almost like fear, or perhaps grief wearing fear's clothing, and Marcus had never quite been able to decide which. He got his answer to that question sooner than he expected, though he wouldn't understand what he was looking at yet. At 9 that same morning, Eleanor Ashford summoned Simone to the East Parlor, a room that stayed locked most days and only opened when Eleanor herself wanted it opened, a room the rest of the staff had learned simply not to ask about. The room smelled faintly of old wood polish and cut flowers long past their bloom. Heavy curtains pulled halfway across tall windows that let in thin bars of light that fell in careful stripes across the old rug. Eleanor sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, watching Simone arrange a fresh bouquet with an intensity that had nothing to do with flowers, an intensity that followed the movement of Simone's hands rather than the arrangement itself. "You have good hands," Eleanor said finally, her voice carrying the particular weight of someone choosing every word with care, testing each one before letting it out into the room. "Steady, patient. Your mother had hands like that." Simone paused, a stem of white lilies still between her fingers, her whole body going momentarily still. "I don't know anything about my mother, Mrs. Ashford." Something moved across Eleanor's face, quick and complicated, gone before Simone could name it. Something that flickered between longing and dread in the space of a single breath. "Do you know your mother's name?" "No, ma'am." Simone kept her voice even, the way she kept everything even in this house, though something in her chest had tightened at the question, some old, familiar ache surfacing without warning. "I was raised in state care. There wasn't a name in my file. Just me." Eleanor's expression cracked open for half a second into something that looked almost like relief, and beneath the relief, something closer to grief, before she folded it all back into the composed, distant mask she wore for everyone in this house, including, it seemed, herself. "Of course," she said quietly, and looked away toward the window, her hands folding tightly in her lap. "Finish the flowers. And Simone, thank you for everything you do here. I don't say that enough." Simone said nothing, because there was nothing in that sentence she knew how to answer. Only the strange, unshakable feeling that she had just walked through a door in a conversation that led somewhere she wasn't allowed to see yet, a door that had opened only a crack before closing again. She finished the flowers in silence, arranging the last of the lilies with careful, unhurried hands, and Eleanor Ashford watched her the entire time with the eyes of a woman guarding a secret she had carried for 11 years. One that was about to cost her far more than her silence ever had, though neither of them yet understood how soon that cost would come due. Preston Ashford came home from Chicago in a mood that the entire staff could feel before he'd even walked through the front door, the kind of foul temper that seemed to travel ahead of him like weather rolling in off the water. The deal he'd flown out to close, a partnership he'd spent 4 months courting. For months of dinners and phone calls and careful flattery aimed at men who held the kind of capital he needed to keep his own finances afloat, had fallen apart in a conference room 3 days earlier, collapsing over a due diligence question he hadn't been prepared to answer. He had spent the flight home rehearsing every way it wasn't his fault, running through the meeting again and again in his head until the story, he told himself, bore only a passing resemblance to what had actually happened in that room. By the time his car came up the long gravel drive, gravel crunching under tires in a sound the staff had learned to recognize and brace for, he was already looking for something smaller than himself to be angry at, and Belmont Manor was full of smaller things. He found fault with the temperature of his study first, storming in and declaring it too cold, though the thermostat hadn't been touched since he left 4 days earlier, standing exactly where he'd set it himself. Then it was a scuff on the hallway floor near his father's old study, a mark that had been there for weeks, worn into the old wood by decades of foot traffic, and that Simone hadn't made, though she was the one standing nearest when he noticed it, tray in hand, on her way to collect his luggage. Then it was the armchair in his study, moved 4 inches to the left for cleaning and never quite returned to the exact position he remembered, as if 4 inches of furniture were the true measure of a man's control over his own house, as if getting that detail wrong somehow proved that everything else in his life was equally out of his hands. "Do you people not understand that things have a place?" Preston said, not quite to Simone, not quite past her either, the particular tone of a man who wanted an audience for his frustration without wanting to actually address the person in front of him directly, without wanting to grant her the dignity of a real conversation even in anger. Simone said nothing, moved the chair the 4 inches back with quiet efficiency, and kept her eyes down, because eye contact in moments like this only ever gave men like Preston more to react to, more surface to project his failures onto. Camille, home from her own errands and sensing an opportunity to align herself with her husband's mood, arrived in the doorway at exactly the wrong moment, her arms already crossed before she'd even taken in the scene. "You should write her up," Camille said, studying Simone the way you'd study a stain you were trying to decide how to remove, her voice pitched for Preston's benefit rather than any genuine grievance. "The attitude in this house has gotten completely out of hand." Simone had said one sentence all morning, and it had been "yes, sir," to Preston 20 minutes earlier, delivered exactly as it always was, without inflection, without complaint. There was no attitude to write up. There was only a woman standing perfectly still, hands folded in front of her the exact way she had trained herself to stand years ago, absorbing whatever was thrown at her with a stillness that had cost her more discipline than either Camille or Preston would ever understand or care to understand. The room held that particular, ugly quiet that exists only when two people with all the power in a relationship are enjoying, consciously or not, having it, feeding off each other's cruelty in a way that made each of them slightly worse than they would have been alone. The real blow landed 3 days later, and it did not come from Preston or Camille directly. It came from a mistake that wasn't even Simone's to carry, though she would carry it anyway, the way she carried most things in this house that weren't hers. Rosalind, still barely 3 months into the job, and still carrying the weight of a family back home who needed every dollar she sent, a mother whose medical bills had climbed past what her wages could cover no matter how carefully she budgeted, had taken a small gold bracelet from Camille's dressing room, not out of greed, but out of a desperation that had been building for weeks. A desperation Simone recognized because she had lived close enough to it herself once, in the years before Belmont. In months where the choice between rent and food had felt like no choice at all. Rosalind hadn't planned it. She'd seen the bracelet lying carelessly on the dresser, thought of her mother's medical bills piling higher each month, and made a choice she was already regretting within the hour, terrified and unable to undo it without confessing everything and losing the only steady income she had. Simone found out by accident, catching Rosalind in tears in the laundry room with the bracelet still in her apron pocket, her whole body shaking with a fear that had nothing to do with getting caught and everything to do with what came after, back home, if she lost this job. Simone did the only thing her conscience would let her do. She took the bracelet, returned it quietly to the dressing room drawer herself while Camille was occupied elsewhere in the house, and when Camille noticed it had been moved from its usual spot, Simone stepped forward before anyone else could and said she'd misplaced it while cleaning, that it had simply ended up in the wrong drawer during her rounds, an honest mistake, nothing more, nothing that warranted the reaction it was about to receive. Camille did not believe a word of it. "You expect me to think a bracelet just wandered into the wrong drawer on its own?" Camille's voice climbed in the front hallway, loud enough that two other staff members paused mid-task to listen, loud enough that it was clearly meant to be heard by exactly that many people, meant to be witnessed rather than simply expressed. I think we both know what actually happened here, and I think it's time this house stopped pretending it doesn't. The word theft never left Camille's mouth directly, but she built the accusation so precisely around its edges, with pauses exactly where the word would have gone, with a look that filled in the silence more effectively than the word itself could have, that everyone standing in that hallway understood exactly what she meant, and Simone stood there absorbing an accusation that wasn't even true, protecting a girl who was too frightened to protect herself, receiving, in return for her decency, the ugliest words Camille had ever aimed at her in 6 years of aiming words at her. It was Margaret Doyle who broke the silence, stepping into the hallway with a firmness in her voice that startled everyone, including Simone, who had never once seen Margaret raise her voice for anyone in 6 years of working under her, who had come to think of Margaret's quiet reserve as simply the shape of the woman. Simone Carter has never taken a single thing from this house that wasn't hers to take, Margaret said, each word deliberate, controlled, absolutely unwilling to bend, her spine straighter than Simone had ever seen it. I have known her character for 6 years, and I will not stand here and listen to it questioned over a bracelet that was returned before anyone even noticed it was gone. If there's a thief in this house, Mrs. Ashford, it is not her. Camille, and used to being contradicted by staff, and used to anyone in this house speaking to her with that particular register of authority, opened her mouth to respond, and then closed it again, some old instinct telling her this was not a fight worth having in front of an audience that included 2 wide-eyed staff members who would certainly talk about it later. She turned and walked away instead, her heels sharp against the hardwood, leaving the accusation hanging in the hallway like something nobody wanted to clean up, though everyone present understood it would need cleaning eventually. That night, long after the house had gone dark and the last light in the kitchen had been switched off, Simone sat across from Margaret at the small worn table where the staff took their meals, 2 cups of tea going cold between them, steam long since stopped rising. Margaret's hands were folded around her cup, and there was something in her face that night that Simone hadn't seen before, something tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour, something that looked like it had been building for years rather than hours. You didn't have to do that, Simone said quietly, watching Margaret's face carefully. Defend me like that, in front of everyone. Yes, I did, Margaret said, and there was no hesitation in it at all, no doubt in her voice whatsoever. Simone studied her for a long moment, the tea steam long gone, the kitchen quiet around them except for the old refrigerator's low hum. Why do you look out for me the way you do, Margaret? More than the other girls. I've noticed it for years. I've just never asked. Margaret's hands tightened slightly around her cup, her knuckles going pale, and for a moment, something moved behind her eyes that looked almost like she might finally say it. Whatever it was, the thing she'd been carrying quietly for 6 years in this house, the thing that had shaped every protective instinct she'd ever shown toward this particular young woman. But she only shook her head, a small, private motion, and looked down into her tea instead of at Simone's face, unable to hold her gaze while the truth sat so close to the surface. Because somebody should have, Margaret said finally, her voice low and rough at the edges. A long time before I ever did. Simone didn't press her. She had learned, in this house, that some silences were doors you didn't force open before they were ready, and she let this one close gently between them, unaware that on the other side of it was the answer to a question she'd been asking her entire life, without ever knowing the right words to ask it, an answer that Margaret herself had been guarding at real cost to her own peace for every one of those 6 years. Eleanor Ashford collapsed in the garden on a Tuesday morning, just past 10, while cutting roses for the dining room table the way she had done every week for 30 years, rain or shine. A ritual she'd never once delegated to anyone else no matter how her hands had begun to ache with age. Marcus found her first, crumpled near the trellis with the shears still loose in her hand, a scatter of cut roses fallen across the gravel path around her, and the sound he made calling for help was one none of the staff had ever heard from him before, a raw, unguarded panic that cut clean through the quiet of the morning and brought two other staff members running from opposite ends of the property. By the time the ambulance reached Belmont Manor, its lights cutting silently across the gravel drive, Eleanor was conscious again, but her left hand trembled in a way it hadn't before, a fine, persistent tremor she tried and failed to hide from the paramedics, and the doctors used the words minor stroke in the careful, measured tone doctors use when they mean something more serious than the words themselves suggest. The house shifted overnight. Where Eleanor's presence had always been quiet and watchful, moving through the halls with the settled authority of a woman who had run this estate for 4 decades, her absence from the day-to-day running of the estate created a vacuum that Preston moved to fill almost immediately, calling Judge Harold Heiress, the family's attorney of nearly 30 years, before his mother had even been discharged from the hospital, before anyone had confirmed she would fully recover the use of her hand. Heiress arrived at Belmont 2 days later, a tall, careful man in his 60s who had drafted nearly every legal document this family had signed for 3 decades, wills and trusts and property transfers going back to Eleanor's own husband's estate, and who carried himself now with the particular stiffness of a man holding something he did not want to be holding, a weight visible in the set of his shoulders as he walked from his car to the front door. He met with Eleanor and Preston together in the study, and though the door was closed, Simone, dusting the hallway shelves nearby with the same careful attention she gave every task, heard enough of the conversation through the old walls to understand that something in that room did not sit easily with anyone inside it, that the silence between sentences carried its own kind of tension. "Mother, we need to finalize the transfer while you're still able to sign," Preston said, his voice pitched low but tight with urgency he wasn't quite hiding well enough, each word coming faster than the last. "You collapsed 2 days ago. We don't know what happens next time. I need the estate settled, and I need it settled now, while everything's still clear." "There are things that need to be settled first," Eleanor said, and even through the wall, Simone could hear something in the old woman's voice that sounded less like refusal and more like fear, a fear she had clearly been carrying long before this stroke ever gave it new urgency, a fear worn smooth from years of handling. "What things?" Preston's voice climbed slightly, frustration bleeding through the careful concern he'd led with. "Mother, there is nothing left to settle. There's the house, there's the accounts, there's the transfer, and there's you signing it. What could possibly still need settling after 30 years? Eleanor did not answer him. Heiress, from what Simone could hear, said almost nothing at all during the exchange, his silence its own kind of answer, and when he finally left the study an hour later, his face carried the look of a man who knew something heavier than his professional silence was built to hold, a man who had spent 30 years keeping this family's secrets and was beginning, for the first time, to wonder whether that loyalty had cost more than it was worth, whether the comfortable distance of professional discretion had quietly curdled into something closer to complicity. With Eleanor weakened and largely confined to her room for rest, a nurse now stationed in the house around the clock, Camille saw an opening she had clearly been waiting for without ever admitting it to herself. She began consolidating control of the household in small, deliberate moves, reassigning staff schedules without explanation, cutting Simone's hours under the excuse of restructuring, a word she used often and defined never, and quietly excluding her from any task that required being trusted alone in a room, tasks that had never once been a problem before Eleanor's collapse, before whatever had shifted in the air of this house that Camille could feel but couldn't name. It wasn't cruelty with a clear motive, not entirely. It was something closer to instinct, an animal sense in Camille that something in this house had shifted in a direction she could not name and could not control, and every part of her wanted whatever that unnamed thing was gone before it became a problem she couldn't undo, before it grew into something too large for her to manage the way she managed everything else in her life, through will and pressure and control. Camille had no idea why Eleanor watched Simone the way she did, why the old woman's eyes tracked her across rooms with an attention she gave no one else in this house, staff or family, an attention that had nothing to do with supervision and everything to do with something Camille couldn't have named even if she tried. Camille only knew that it unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain to Preston without sounding paranoid, without inviting the kind of dismissive laugh he gave her when her instincts ran ahead of her evidence. And so she did what she always did with feelings she couldn't name. She turned them into control, tightening her grip on the one person in the house she could still control completely, as if enough small cruelties might finally answer the question she couldn't bring herself to ask directly. It was Marcus who found the box. A storm had come through hard 3 nights earlier, wind tearing branches from the old oaks, and rain driving sideways for the better part of 6 hours, tearing loose a section of roofing over the old carriage house archives, a cramped, dust-heavy room where the family had stored decades of odds and ends nobody had bothered sorting through in years, furniture too sentimental to throw away and too outdated to use, boxes labeled in handwriting from 3 generations back. Marcus went in to assess the water damage, flashlight in hand, careful of his footing on floorboards gone soft in places, and found a cardboard box near the back wall, warped soft at the corners, the ink on its side label bled illegible by moisture that had crept in through the damaged roof. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper gone yellow with age, were the belongings of a woman named Charlotte Ashford, Preston's late wife, a name Marcus had heard exactly twice in 15 years of working this estate. Always spoken quickly and never explained, always followed by a silence that discouraged further questions. Among the water-stained letters, their ink blurred in places past reading, and a few pieces of costume jewelry gone tarnished with age, Marcus found a photograph, its edges softened by damp, but its image still clear enough to make out. A young woman with a warm, uncertain smile, holding an infant wrapped in a pale blanket, the same suspended expression caught between happiness and something more guarded. He didn't understand what he was looking at. He only understood, with the same certainty that had made him a careful and trusted man for 15 years, a man who noticed things and knew which things were worth carrying forward and which were better left buried, that this was not something to bring to the family. Not yet. Not without understanding it first. He carried the photograph, still slightly damp at one corner, across the yard to the carriage house where the staff lived, and knocked on Simone's door before he'd fully decided what he was going to say, before he'd rehearsed any version of this conversation. She opened it in her work uniform, mid-shift, expecting a question about the garden beds or a delivery that needed signing for, wiping her hands on her apron out of habit. Instead, Marcus held out the photograph without a word, watching her face as she took it, watching the exact moment her expression shifted from confusion into something that looked like the floor had opened beneath her, her whole body going still in a way he'd never seen from her before, not even in the worst of Camille's public humiliations. It was the same photograph, the same worn corners, the same young woman with the same uncertain smile, holding the same infant in the same pale blanket, propped against the mirror in her own room not 30 feet from where they now stood, a photograph she had looked at every morning of her life, without ever once knowing its origin. Neither of them said anything for a long moment, the greenhouse's quiet pressing in around them, distant birdsong the only sound. Marcus watched Simone's hands begin to shake, the way they'd shaken kneeling on the flagstone weeks earlier, except this time there was no wine, no ruined dress, no crowd of 40 strangers, only a photograph that meant her entire life had just become a question she didn't know how to ask, a question with roots reaching somewhere inside this very house. That crushing, disorienting moment did not stay private for long. 3 nights later, at a family dinner Eleanor was too weakened to attend. Confined to her room under the nurse's careful watch, Preston arrived at the table already several drinks into an evening fueled by the frustration of a mother still refusing to sign. His tie loosened, his voice carrying the particular looseness of a man who'd stopped monitoring himself several glasses ago. And he found, once again, the easiest target for that frustration standing quietly at the edge of the room, refilling water glasses, saying nothing, present but invisible the way the room had always required her to be. "You know," Preston said, loud enough for the 6 guests at the table to hear clearly. His words blurred slightly at the edges, his hand gesturing loosely towards Simone without quite looking at her. "I've never understood why my mother keeps her around like this. It's not like she's family. She's a charity case Margaret's kept out of guilt for years, and frankly, I think it's long past time this house stopped pretending otherwise." The table went silent, forks pausing midair, one guest's eyes darting uncomfortably toward her own plate. Simone stood perfectly still, the water pitcher held steady in her hands despite everything happening inside her, her face composed into the same stillness that had carried her through every humiliation this house had ever handed her, a stillness that had become its own kind of armor over 6 long years. And then, from the doorway, in a wheelchair she had been confined to for exactly 9 days, her nurse trailing anxiously behind her, having clearly failed to stop her. Eleanor Ashford slammed her trembling hand flat against the frame hard enough that the sound cracked through the dining room like a shot, hard enough that it must have hurt, though nothing in her face showed it. "Enough." One word. The whole table turned. Preston's mouth fell open, some drunken protest half formed and immediately forgotten, his glass frozen halfway to his lips. It was the first time in this entire story that Eleanor had defended Simone openly, in front of witnesses, without hiding behind a locked parlor door or a careful, coded question about a mother whose name she never quite said out loud, without the safety of privacy to soften what the moment revealed. Nobody at that table understood why the old woman's eyes, fixed on Simone across the room, were suddenly, unmistakably full of tears, tears she made no attempt to wipe away, as though for the first time in 11 years she had simply run out of the strength required to hide them. Margaret found Simone in the carriage house that same night, still sitting on the edge of her bed with the water pitcher's ghost still in her hands, though she'd set it down hours ago, her fingers still curled, as if holding something that was no longer there. The dinner had ended in the kind of silence that follows a scene nobody knows how to walk back from. Guests gathering their things earlier than planned, murmuring polite excuses about early mornings that fooled no one. Preston disappearing into his study with a bottle he clearly intended to finish alone. Eleanor wheeled back to her room by a nurse who had learned, in 9 days, not to ask questions about what she witnessed in that house. Margaret didn't knock so much as push the door open slowly. The way you open a door when you already know what you're going to find on the other side of it. When you've rehearsed this exact moment more times in your head than you'd ever admit. "I need to show you something," Margaret said, and her voice had none of its usual steadiness left in it, cracking slightly on the last word. "I should have shown you a long time ago. I told myself I was protecting you. I'm starting to think I was only protecting myself." She led Simone to her own small room at the end of the hall, a room Simone had been inside perhaps a dozen times in 6 years, always briefly, always for some practical reason, never long enough to notice the small details that now seemed to matter. A faded photograph tucked into the corner of Margaret's own mirror that Simone had never once thought to ask about. Margaret knelt beside her bed, her joints protesting audibly, and pulled a shoebox from beneath it, the cardboard gone soft with age in the same way the box in the carriage house archives had gone soft, and from inside it she withdrew a single folded letter, the paper thin and creased from being opened and closed too many times over too many years, the fold lines gone nearly translucent with wear. "This is from Charlotte," Margaret said, and her hands were shaking now too, an old woman's hands trembling around a piece of paper she had guarded for 15 years, guarded through every one of Simone's 6 years in this house, through every humiliation she'd watched and said nothing about. Charlotte Ashford, Preston's wife. She wrote this to me 3 weeks before she died, and I have never shown it to a single living soul, because showing it to you would have meant telling you everything else, and I was afraid, Simone. I have been afraid for 15 years. Simone took the letter with hands that didn't feel entirely like her own anymore, her fingers cold despite the warmth of the room. The handwriting was careful, rounded, a young woman's hand, slightly uneven in places as though written in a hurry, or written through tears, and as she read, the room around her seemed to narrow down to nothing but the words on the page, words that confirmed what the photograph had already told her 3 days earlier, without quite letting her believe it, without letting the knowledge settle into something she could act on. Charlotte Ashford had been her mother. Preston Ashford, the man who had called her a charity case at his own dinner table 3 hours ago, was her father. She had been given up in secret, in circumstances Margaret still would not fully explain, out of a fear so old and so carefully buried that even now, 15 years later, Margaret couldn't bring herself to say all of it out loud, her eyes fixed somewhere on the floor rather than on Simone's face. Simone did not cry. She did not speak for a long time, the letter held loosely in her lap, the weight of 6 years in this house rearranging itself behind her eyes into a shape she couldn't yet make sense of, into an architecture too large to see all at once. Every humiliation, every night she'd knelt on a floor that was, by right, hers. Every time Camille had looked at her like something to be managed, every time Preston had looked through her like furniture, all of it recalculating itself in real time into something almost too large to hold, a lifetime of small cruelties suddenly wearing an entirely different face. "Why didn't you tell me?" Simone said finally, and it wasn't quite an accusation, though it carried enough weight to be one, her voice steadier than she felt. "Because Preston and Camille are dangerous when they feel threatened," Margaret said, meeting her eyes now, finally. "And I have watched this family long enough to know that threatened people in houses like this do not always behave like reasonable people. Eleanor has protected this secret out of genuine fear for what happens if it comes out wrong, not just out of cruelty, though God knows she's earned some of that judgment too. I needed you safe before I needed you to know the truth, Simone. I still don't know if I got that order right." That night, unable to sleep, unable to sit still with the letter now folded back into her own pocket instead of Margaret's shoebox, the paper pressing warm against her side like something alive, Simone walked out to the greenhouse where she knew, even at this hour, Marcus sometimes stayed late tending to a stubborn row of seedlings that hadn't been thriving the way he wanted them to. She found him there under a single hanging lamp, the glass panels around him fogged faintly with condensation, and she told him everything, the letter, the photograph, 15 years of silence finally breaking open in the space of one dinner table sentence, her voice steady through most of it, and only breaking once, near the end, when she spoke Charlotte's name aloud for the first time. Marcus listened without interrupting, his hands going still over the soil, the way he always did when something mattered enough to require his full attention, and when she finished, he didn't offer her advice, didn't tell her what she should do with a truth this size, didn't presume to know better than she did what a discovery like this required of a person. He only said, quiet and steady, setting down the small trowel he'd been holding, "Whatever you choose, Simone, you don't have to choose it as someone with nothing anymore." It was the impossible choice, laid out as plainly as Marcus could put it without pretending it was simple, without pretending either option came free of cost. She could walk away from Belmont Manor entirely, take this truth with her, and never claim a single thing this house owed her, sparing herself whatever danger came with a name like Ashford being contested in rooms full of lawyers and old money, sparing herself the exhausting spectacle of proving, to people who had spent 6 years refusing to truly see her, exactly who she was. Or she could stay in a house that had humiliated her nearly every day for 6 years, now carrying the knowledge that every insult thrown her way had been thrown at a woman with more legal and moral claim to this house than anyone currently living in it, staying not for the house itself, but for something closer to justice, something closer to the truth finally being spoken in rooms that had spent 15 years avoiding it. She chose to stay, but she said nothing to Preston, nothing to Camille, not even a full accounting to Eleanor of what she now knew. Understanding instinctively that knowledge held quietly was knowledge that couldn't be taken from her, twisted against her, or used to force her hand before she was ready. She decided, lying awake long after Marcus had walked her back to the carriage house under a sky gone clear and star-heavy after the earlier storms, that she would not depend entirely on Margaret's 15-year-old letter and a photograph with soft corners. She would watch. She would gather what proof she could find on her own terms, in her own time, before she let this house know that the ground beneath it had shifted, before she handed anyone in that family the chance to prepare a defense against a truth they didn't yet know was coming for them. Camille noticed the change before anyone else did, though she couldn't have said exactly what she was noticing, couldn't have pointed to a single specific behavior and called it evidence. It wasn't anything Simone said or did differently in her daily tasks, which continued exactly as they always had, efficient, quiet, unremarkable to anyone watching casually. It was something in her stillness, a new quality to the way she held herself that no longer read as quiet deference, but as something closer to patience, the patience of someone waiting rather than someone simply enduring, and the distinction, though subtle, was one Camille felt in her body before she could have named it in words. It unsettled Camille in a way she couldn't articulate to Preston without sounding unreasonable, without inviting the exact dismissiveness she'd learned to expect from him whenever her instincts outran her evidence. And so, as she always did with feelings she couldn't name, she turned it into suspicion, into a need to search, to catch, to confirm. She searched Simone's room twice that week while Simone was on shift, careful, quick searches through drawers and beneath the mattress, moving items back into approximately their original positions afterward, finding nothing, because Simone had learned long ago in a life defined by having very little that the safest place to keep something was never in a room someone else had the keys to. Camille found no letter, no photograph, no proof of anything, and the absence of evidence did nothing to calm her, if anything convincing her more deeply that something was being hidden from her somewhere she simply hadn't thought to look yet. If anything, it convinced her more deeply that something was being hidden from her, and her response, as it had always been in this house, was to push harder rather than to ask honestly, escalating the very tension she was so desperate to relieve, tightening her grip on a house that was, without her knowledge, already slipping through her fingers. Eleanor sensed the change in Simone before Camille ever put words to her own suspicion, though the old woman read it correctly where Camille could not, her decades of watching this young woman granting her an understanding no one else in the house possessed. She had spent 11 years watching this young woman from a careful distance, cataloging every small mannerism that echoed Charlotte. The way she tilted her head when she was listening closely, the particular steadiness of her hands under pressure, the quiet way she carried herself through rooms as though trying not to take up more space than necessary. And now, in the days following that dinner table outburst, Eleanor saw something new settle into Simone's bearing. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to knowledge, carried quietly, held in the set of her shoulders and the new directness of her gaze. And Eleanor understood, with the clarity of a woman who had lied by omission for over a decade, that the time for silence had finally run out, that whatever came next was no longer within her power to delay. She summoned Simone to the east parlor on a gray afternoon, rain moving in slow sheets against the tall windows, streaking the old glass in long silver lines. And this time, she did not ask coded questions about mothers or hands. She had the nurse leave them alone, waving her off with unusual firmness, and she gestured Simone into the chair across from her rather than leaving her standing. A small gesture that told Simone everything she needed to know about what kind of conversation this was about to be, a conversation between equals rather than mistress and maid. "You know," Eleanor said. It wasn't a question, and there was no pretense left in the way she said it. "I know some of it," Simone said, meeting her eyes directly for what felt like the first time in 6 years. "I don't know all of it. I'd like to." Eleanor's hands, resting in her lap, trembled slightly. The whether from the stroke or from what she was about to say, Simone couldn't tell, and perhaps Eleanor herself couldn't have separated the two anymore. "Charlotte didn't die of illness," Eleanor said finally, the words coming slow and deliberate, as though she'd rehearsed them 1,000 times in her head over 15 years, and was only now discovering how much heavier they were out loud. How different the weight felt once released into the air between two people rather than carried alone. That's what this family has told everyone for 32 years, and it was never true. Charlotte died running from this house, from her own husband, because she had discovered something Preston never wanted found. Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the rain-streaked window, toward some point in the past only she could see clearly, her voice growing distant, as though she were speaking from inside the memory itself rather than from this room, this chair, this present moment. Preston had been bleeding this estate dry for years before Charlotte ever caught it. Bad investments made against my late husband's wishes. Debts he hid from all of us. Borrowed against accounts that weren't fully his to borrow against. Using the family name as collateral in deals none of us ever consented to. Charlotte found the paperwork by accident, going through old files for something else entirely. She confronted him, and when he wouldn't listen, when he laughed off her concerns the way he laughs off everything he doesn't want to face, she told him she'd expose it, take it to the family's own attorney if she had to, because she was terrified of what would happen to her daughter's inheritance if he was allowed to keep hollowing this house out in secret. Her daughter, Simone repeated, quiet, though she already knew, the words settling into her chest like something finally finding its proper place. "You," Eleanor said, and for the first time in this entire story, her composure broke entirely, tears finally falling freely down a face that had spent 11 years perfecting the art of not showing anyone what she carried, her shoulders shaking with a grief she had never once allowed herself to release in front of another living person. Charlotte died in a car accident 3 weeks after that confrontation, fleeing this house in the middle of the night with you in her arms. On a road she wouldn't have been driving if she hadn't been running from her own husband, running toward a friend's house 4 counties away, where she thought she might finally be safe. I have told myself for 32 years that it was simply an accident. I no longer entirely believe that, and I have been too much of a coward to ever say those words to anyone, including myself, for every single one of those 32 years. Simone sat with that in silence, the rain filling the space where words should have been, streaking down the tall windows in long, unhurried lines that seemed to slow time itself. "I was the one who arranged for you to be placed with the state," Eleanor continued, her voice raw now, stripped of every careful distance she had maintained for over a decade, each word costing her visibly more than the last. "I told myself I was protecting you from a father who had already shown he saw you as a liability rather than a daughter, a father who never once asked after you in the months following Charlotte's death, never once wondered where his own infant daughter had gone. I was also protecting this family's name from a scandal I did not have the courage to face, a scandal that would have exposed not just Preston's fraud, but my own failure to stop it while it was still small enough to stop. And 11 years ago, when Margaret came to me, having found you through channels I still don't fully understand, private investigators and old contacts she never fully explained to me, and told me you were working as a maid not 4 hours from this house, I made the decision to bring you here, to watch over you, without ever telling you who you were. I told myself it was penance. I understand now it was simply a different, quieter kind of cruelty, dressed up as care, a cruelty that cost you 6 years you can never get back. This recontextualized everything. Preston's cruelty towards Simone across 6 years had never been simple class contempt, the kind of thoughtless disregard the wealthy so often extend toward those who serve them. Some buried instinct in him had recognized, without ever consciously naming it, a threat to a fortune he had already spent a decade quietly draining. A fortune the original terms of Charlotte's will would strip entirely from his control if her daughter were ever found, confirmed, and given what was legally hers. A fortune he had built his entire adult identity around controlling. Camille's paranoia across the same 6 years had never been baseless jealousy over nothing. Never simply the insecurity of a woman married into money she hadn't earned. Some part of her had sensed exactly what Eleanor had always known and never said, that the woman she treated as beneath her held a claim to this house that outranked her own by right of blood and by right of law, a claim that made every one of Camille's cruelties, in retrospect, look like something closer to fear dressed as contempt. And Margaret's fierce, unexplained protectiveness across all 6 years was, at last, fully explained. She had been Charlotte's closest friend in this world, the two of them close as sisters in the years before Charlotte's death, and she had spent 15 years quietly honoring a promise made to a dying woman to watch over her daughter from whatever distance the family's fear allowed her, carrying that promise like a secret job alongside her official duties in this house. The photograph Marcus had found in the storm-damaged box was confirmed, in that parlor, as the single surviving image of mother and daughter together, taken days before Charlotte's death by a friend visiting that week, the only proof of a bond the family had spent 32 years pretending never existed. The last physical evidence of a woman the Ashfords had erased so thoroughly that even her own daughter had grown up not knowing her name. Judge Heiress was called that same evening, summoned from his own home in the middle of a quiet dinner with his wife. And this time, released from 30 years of professional silence by Eleanor herself, who called him personally to insist he come immediately. He laid out for Simone exactly what the truth meant in terms the law would recognize, spreading documents across the parlor table with hands that no longer shook the way they had in recent weeks. Charlotte's original will, drafted quietly in the months before her death with Ferris's own predecessor at the firm, and never fully revoked despite Preston's repeated efforts over the years to have it declared void, named her daughter sole heir to her personal shares in the Belmont estate, a controlling interest that Preston had spent the better part of a decade illegally leveraging against debts he had never disclosed to a single member of his own family, debts that had grown, compounded, and multiplied in the shadows of an estate everyone assumed was simply thriving. "If you can prove your identity," Heiress said, his voice steady now in a way it hadn't been in weeks, the weight finally shifting off his own shoulders and onto the paper where it belonged, where it had always belonged. "You don't simply inherit a house, Simone. You inherit the legal standing to expose a decade of financial fraud, and to reclaim full control of an estate that was always, in the truest sense, yours, regardless of whose name has been on the deed these past 32 years. Preston was called into the study the following morning, summoned by his own mother for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, a summons delivered through the nurse rather than spoken directly, which alone told him something had shifted overnight. He walked in expecting another argument about the transfer papers still sitting unsigned on Ferris's desk, already composing his opening remarks about urgency and time running out, about a mother too stubborn to see reason. What he found instead was Eleanor seated by the window, her posture straighter than he'd seen it in weeks despite the stroke, Heiress standing beside her with a folder in his hands thick enough to make Preston's stomach tighten before a single word was spoken, and Simone standing quietly near the door, not as staff this time, not with her hands folded and her eyes down, but standing the way a person stands when they have finally stopped waiting for permission to take up space in a room, her chin level, her gaze unflinching in a way that unsettled him before he understood why. It took Heiress less than 10 minutes to lay it all out, his voice measured and precise, a lawyer's voice stripped of any warmth he might have once extended to a longtime client. Charlotte's original will, the controlling shares, the decade of undisclosed debts and quiet leveraging Preston had used to keep the estate's true financial condition hidden from everyone, including the mother who had trusted him to manage what her husband had left behind. Documents spread across the desk in an order Heiress had clearly rehearsed for maximum, undeniable clarity. Preston's composure did not survive the explanation. It came apart in real time, not into remorse, not into the kind of reckoning the room might have hoped for after everything, but into a raw, cornered panic that revealed, more clearly than anything Heiress had said, exactly how deep the deception ran, how long he had been living inside a lie he'd convinced himself he could manage indefinitely. "You don't understand what I was trying to do," Preston said, his voice climbing, his hands moving in useless, defensive gestures that seemed to search the air for something solid to hold on to. The market turned. I was going to fix it before anyone needed to know. I was protecting this family. You were protecting yourself, Eleanor said, and there was no anger left in her voice, only a tiredness that had been building for 32 years and had finally run out of road, a tiredness that made her words land heavier than any shout could have. When Camille arrived, drawn by the raised voices from somewhere down the hall, and understood in fragments what was being discussed, piecing together enough from the scattered sentences to grasp the shape of the disaster unfolding, Preston turned on her with an ugliness the room hadn't seen from him even at his worst dinner table moments. Blaming her cruelty toward Simone for accelerating a crisis he insisted he could have controlled quietly, on his own terms, if she'd simply left things alone. If her constant campaign against Simone hadn't drawn attention to a household tension that might otherwise have stayed buried. It was, in its own bitter way, the truest thing he said all morning, and it landed exactly as badly as it deserved to. The accusation and the confession tangled together in a single ugly sentence. Camille, who had spent 6 years believing herself untouchable in this house by virtue of the name she'd married into, stood in that study and watched her marriage come apart in front of witnesses, watched every insult she had ever aimed at Simone rearrange itself into something she would now have to answer for, legally and socially, in ways she had never once considered possible when she'd thought herself simply enforcing the natural order of a house she believed she understood completely. For the first time in this entire story, Camille was afraid rather than cruel, and there was no theater left in it at all, no rehearsed outrage, no performance for an audience, only the plain, unguarded fear of a woman realizing the ground beneath her had never been as solid as she'd assumed. The confrontation that mattered most, though, didn't happen in that crowded study. It happened 2 days later, in the East Parlor, the same room where Simone had once arranged white lilies under Eleanor's watchful, guilty eyes, the same room where Eleanor had finally broken her silence in the rain, the same walls that had held every careful, coded question Eleanor had ever asked her. Simone asked to speak with Preston alone, and Heiress, understanding exactly what kind of moment this needed to be, made sure it happened without an audience of lawyers or family standing by to shape it into something else, something performative rather than true. She did not raise her voice. She had spent 6 years in this house learning the particular discipline of stillness under pressure, and she did not abandon it now, even facing the man who had called her a charity case at his own dinner table 3 weeks earlier, not knowing he was speaking those words to his own daughter, words that had cut deeper precisely because of a connection he hadn't known existed. "I'm not here to scream at you," Simone said, standing in the same spot where Eleanor had once questioned her about a mother's name she didn't yet know she carried, her voice level, unhurried, carrying none of the theater this house had always trafficked in. I could. God knows I've earned the right to, 6 years of it. But I don't need to perform anger the way this house has always performed everything. And I think some part of you already understands that. Preston said nothing, his jaw tight, his eyes unable to hold steady on her face, drifting instead toward the window, toward the door, toward anywhere that wasn't the weight of what she was saying. You cost me a mother, Simone continued, her voice never rising, never breaking, carrying instead a quiet, devastating precision that landed harder than shouting ever could have. You cost me a childhood I might have had in this house instead of an estate facility where nobody could tell me who I belonged to, where I spent 18 years looking at a photograph of a woman I now know was my own mother and being told by every adult around me that some questions simply didn't have answers. And you cost me 6 years of humiliation that you could have ended at any single moment, simply by looking at me honestly instead of looking through me like furniture. I don't need you to grovel for that. I need you to understand it. Once, clearly, without an excuse ready in your mouth before I've even finished speaking. Preston opened his mouth, and for the first time in this story, nothing came out. No slogan. No justification. No version of events that let him remain the wronged party. The misunderstood man simply trying to hold a family together under pressure. He simply stood there, stripped of every excuse he had built a life on top of, and said nothing at all, because there was, for the first time, nothing left to say, no angle left to work, no smaller target left in the room to redirect his shame toward. Simone did not choose to destroy him publicly, though the law would have allowed it, and no one in that house would have blamed her for it, though Heiress himself had quietly indicated he'd support whatever course she chose without judgment either way. Working alongside Heiress in the weeks that followed, meeting in the same study where Preston's unraveling had begun, she chose instead a measured, deliberate justice, reclaiming her controlling interest in the estate through the proper legal channels, restructuring its finances with Heiress's careful guidance, poring over documents late into several evenings until the true shape of Preston's decade of quiet fraud was fully mapped out, and removing Preston entirely from any position of financial authority he might have used to cause further harm. She declined to pursue the criminal charges that would have been well within her right to bring, understanding that doing so would devastate Eleanor in whatever years she had left, and choosing, for reasons that had more to do with her own peace than with mercy for Preston, to close this chapter without adding cruelty of her own to a house that already had more than enough of it, without becoming, in her moment of power, the kind of person who had spent 6 years making her small. Eleanor, given at last the chance to make something right after 32 years of carrying it wrong, signed over her own remaining shares to Simone without being asked, without Heiress even needing to raise the question, her hand steadier that day than it had been since the stroke, as though some old weight had finally lifted enough to let her hold a pen properly again. The tremor in her fingers noticeably calmer as she signed her name for what both of them understood to be the last time on any document concerning this house. It was always going to be yours, Eleanor said quietly, the two of them alone in the parlor one final time, rain no longer falling outside, the light through the tall windows gone soft and gold with early evening. I was just too much of a coward to say so while it still mattered. Margaret gathered the household staff in the kitchen on a Thursday morning, the same kitchen where Rosalind had once knelt over broken porcelain, terrified of losing everything, and where Simone had knelt down beside her without a second thought, the morning light falling through the same windows it always had, indifferent to how much had changed beneath it. Margaret told them plainly, without theater, without softening it into something smaller than it was, standing at the head of the long wooden table where 6 years of shared meals had passed between shifts, exactly who Simone Carter really was. Rosalind cried before Margaret had even finished the sentence, openly, without embarrassment, her hand pressed to her mouth, because she understood better than most in that room exactly what kind of person Simone had been to her when nobody had been watching and nothing required her to be kind. When protecting a frightened 20-year-old cost Simone something real, and she'd offered it anyway without hesitation. There was no gasp of disbelief, no dramatic collapse into shock around that table. What moved through that kitchen instead was something quieter, a slow, warm recalculating of 6 years of memory in real time. Staff members thinking back on small kindnesses Simone had shown them, covered shifts, quiet words of encouragement, the time she'd stayed late without being asked to help someone finish a task before a family event, and understanding, only now, exactly how much dignity it must have taken to offer that kindness from inside a house that had never once offered it back to her, from inside a position that gave her every reason to look out only for herself and none at all to look out for anyone else. Camille packed her things 3 days later, moving through what had briefly been her bedroom with a kind of quiet efficiency that looked nothing like the woman who had once turned a spilled glass of wine into a stage production, and in the hallway outside, on her way past with the last of her boxes, she stopped Simone with the kind of hesitation that didn't come naturally to her, that visibly cost her something to allow. The apology, when it came, wasn't eloquent. It wasn't the kind of speech that erases 6 years of cruelty in a single gesture, and Camille didn't try to make it one, didn't reach for more than she'd actually earned. "I mistook fear for justification," Camille said, her voice smaller than Simone had ever heard it, stripped of every theatrical edge that had once defined her presence in every room she entered. "I don't expect that to mean much to you. I just needed to say it before I left, because I don't think I'll get the chance again." Simone accepted it, quiet and honest, without pretending it undid a single humiliating moment she'd carried in this house, without offering more warmth than the moment had actually earned. "Thank you for saying it," she said. "That's enough for me. It doesn't have to be everything." It was, in its own way, the most mature note either of them could have ended on, an ending that didn't pretend forgiveness meant forgetting, and didn't need to, an ending that let both women walk away from 6 years of history, without either one owing the other anything further. She found Marcus in the greenhouse that same evening, the same hanging lamp glowing over the same stubborn row of seedlings that had finally, after weeks of careful attention, begun to show new growth, and she stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching him work before he noticed her there, his hands moving with the same unhurried patience they always had, unchanged by everything that had shifted around him. "I never cared what your last name turned out to be," Marcus said, not looking up right away, his hands steady over the soil the way they always were, though something in his voice carried more weight than the casual words suggested. "Figured you should know that, now that it's finally settled." "That's exactly why I trust what comes next," Simone said, and for the first time in a very long time, there was nothing guarded in the way she said it, nothing held back or measured for safety, the words arriving as simply and honestly as she'd ever let herself speak them. He straightened then, brushing soil from his hands, and for a moment neither of them said anything else, the greenhouse quiet around them except for the soft tick of the old heating pipes and the distant sound of evening settling over the grounds outside. It didn't need to be more than that. 6 years of easy mornings and quiet coffee had already built something between them that didn't require grand declarations to be real, and both of them seemed to understand, standing there in the lamplight, that whatever came next between them could take exactly as long as it needed to. The final image belonged to the veranda, the same flagstone where she had once knelt with a wine-stained napkin in front of 40 strangers who had already decided who she was before she'd ever had the chance to tell them differently, before any of them had known there was anything to tell. It was golden hour now instead of string lights, the late sun pouring long and warm across the same stones, catching the edges of the hedges Marcus tended so carefully, and Simone Carter stood there alone, watching an estate that was, at last, legally and fully hers, in a silence that belonged entirely to her this time. A silence she had chosen rather than one forced on her by 6 years of learning that speaking cost more than it was worth. She thought, standing there, of the group home in Savannah, of the photograph that had traveled with her through every placement, every shift, every small apartment she'd scraped together the rent for, never once knowing it carried the answer to every question she'd ever asked about herself. She thought of Charlotte, a mother she would never get to know except through a single letter and a single photograph, and the fierce, protective love of a friend who had kept her secret and kept her safe for 15 years at real cost to herself. She thought of Margaret, who had chosen, over and over, to look out for a stranger's daughter because somebody should have, long before Margaret ever did. And she thought, finally, of all the mornings still ahead of her in this house. Mornings she would get to walk through not as staff, but as its rightful mistress. Mornings that belonged to her the way nothing in her life ever fully had before. They called her the maid. Not one of them, not once in 6 years, ever stopped to ask who her mother was. If you made it this far, you already know this story was never really about a house. Let us know in the comments what part hit you hardest, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one.